The most recent HUD report revealed that on a single night in America, 771,000 Americans were homeless. There's a lot to unpack in this report, but it's already 2 weeks old, so, mainstream media has pretty much forgotten about it. Worse yet, among the handful of outlets that bothered to even cover it, it was the left-leaning ones that botched the reporting. In our final episode of 2024, I introduced 5 non-negotiables for the left. 5 fundamental concepts that the left can rally behind in order to begin rebuilding meaningful coalitions. These are non-negotiables that are not only crucial to a humane and functioning society, they have the added benefit of being tested, empirical, and really, really popular. So to review, they're Medicare for all, a government-sponsored civilian labor corps, getting money out of politics, centering climate justice in all legislative discussions, and lastly, the topic for today, housing first. Let's get after it and set the record straight. UNFTR. HUD's annual homelessness assessment report, Point-in-Time Estimates of Homelessness, provides a comprehensive overview of homelessness in the United States. The most recent report caused a momentary stir before our collective amnesia kicked in and we moved on to more acts of terrorism, presidential medals of freedom, the impending Trump inauguration, natural disasters. Those actually might be redundant. In other words, the news. One of the stirs was among liberal media outlets, from established ones like the New York Times to the Young Turks Network, both of which used their platforms to highlight one particular aspect of the report, that immigration was one of the primary causes for the increase in homelessness year over year. Now, before we get to that, however, let's look at some of the key findings of the actual report. The number of people experiencing homelessness reached a record high of 771,480 people, or about 23 per every 10,000 people in the United States. Homelessness increased by 18% overall from 23 to 2024. Family homelessness saw the largest increase, rising 39% from the previous year. Nearly 150,000 children experienced homelessness, a 33% increase from 23. Veterans were the only group to show a decline in homelessness, decreasing by 8% from 23 to 24, and we're going to talk a little bit about that one specifically. About 1 in 5 people experiencing homelessness was 55 or older. Black individuals continued to be overrepresented among the homeless population, making up 32% of all people experiencing homelessness. Chronic homelessness reached its highest recorded level, with 152,585 individuals experiencing chronic patterns of homelessness. The national inventory of beds for people experiencing this increased by 13% between 23 and 24, driven mainly by an 18% increase in emergency shelter beds, another important factoid of the report. Nearly 60% of the national bed inventory is now dedicated to permanent housing solutions for people formerly experiencing homelessness. So the report attributes these trends to factors such as the worsening affordable housing crisis, rising inflation, stagnating wages, systemic racism, public health crises, natural disasters, immigration, and the end of pandemic-era homelessness prevention programs. But the 771,000 figure is the highest number ever recorded since the government began tracking this data. These numbers, as shocking as they are, tell only part of the story, because behind each statistic is a human being, someone's parent, child, sibling, or friend, struggling to survive in what is the wealthiest nation in human history. I mean, the contradiction is stark. In a country with more billionaires than ever before, hundreds of thousands of people are sleeping in tents, under bridges, or in their cars. And here's what makes these numbers even more concerning. They're almost certainly an undercount. See, the point-in-time count conducted on a single night misses many people who might be temporarily staying with friends or family, living in motels, or sleeping in places not visible to counters. Moreover, the methodology itself has some inherent limitations. It's challenging to count people who, by necessity or choice, make themselves hard to find. The real scale of housing insecurity in America is likely far greater. Millions more Americans are just one medical emergency, job loss, or rent increase away from losing their housing. This precarity isn't accidental, mind you. It's the predictable result of a system that treats housing as a commodity rather than a human right. Hey folks, the podcast, the website, the newsletters, the resource guide, this YouTube channel, none of it would be possible without the dedication and support of our members. So if you're interested in becoming a member, visit unftr.com today to learn more, or just sign up for our free Yes, I said free weekly newsletter where we feature important news items from trusted sources, a progressive spotlight, an economic chart of the week, books that we're reading, pods that we're listening to, YouTubers that we're watching, and organizations that we support. And did I mention it's free? Go to unftr.com and check it out. Okay, so I originally dropped the 5 non-negotiables in an episode titled The Online Left is Falling Apart, where I argued that some of these so-called bread tubers had swallowed their values to promote the lesser of two evils position during the presidential campaign. Then there are outlets like the Young Turks, who appear to have pivoted to the right after the election. Now, the point here is not to pile on TYT, but in the context of leftist principles generally and housing specifically, I'm going to pick on them because of their prominent role and status among left and liberal viewers online. Let's listen into how TYT broke down the report.
Now, much of the report actually focuses on one of the main factors behind this. So they talk about how the influx of asylum seekers immigrating to the country has exacerbated the housing crisis because we already had a housing crisis spurred by the shortage of housing units available. And so here's what they found. Migration had a particularly notable impact on family homelessness, which rose 39% from 2023 to 2024. In the 13 communities that reported being affected by migration, family homelessness more than doubled. Whereas in the remaining 373 communities, the rise in families experiencing homelessness was less than 8%. So I mean, this is, in my opinion, just simple numbers, logic, supply and demand. There was already high demand for limited housing units, and then you introduce an additional population into the country when you haven't really increased the housing inventory, and it's going to, again, exacerbate the problem. And so during the Biden administration, before he did his executive order for the southern border, he had paroled 1.4 million asylum seekers into the country. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on homelessness when we don't have enough housing to withstand the increase in population.
There's a lot here. And it really comes down to choices made on framing. TYT sets up the piece by offering the same headline figures that we noted before. But when it gets to dissecting the issue, they very narrowly focus on the issue of migration. I read the report, and immigration is mentioned exactly 5 times, and a 6th if you include a sentence about population expansion in sanctuary cities. It's a 117-page report. So let's look at the framing around immigration. Anna rightly notes that homelessness doubled in 13 communities that reported being affected by migration. Then she compares this to the other 373 communities that experienced an 8% increase. To be clear, here's her exact quote again.
In the 13 communities that reported being affected by migration, family homelessness more than doubled. Whereas in the remaining 373 communities, the rise in families experiencing homelessness was less than 8%.
Now let's approach these same figures in a different way. Out of 385 communities reporting into HUD, only 13 noted an increase in homelessness due to immigration. Makes a big difference, doesn't it? Look, we did a 3-part series on the immigration crisis last year, and at no time did I minimize the impact of immigration on the country, especially border towns. In fact, the first in the series spoke to the disastrous effects of mass migration into urban areas like New York City and the overburdening of New York's social services departments. In states like Massachusetts, Illinois, New York, and California, the largest urban centers in the country are experiencing the multifaceted shock of a housing shortage, high interest rates, higher than normal housing prices, and rental inflation, and mass migration, which is tipping some of these areas into crisis. Now add the wildfires into the mix, and you can only imagine what LA is going to be like, for example, and some of the surrounding areas. I mean, this is going to be a very deep and entrenched problem. But to focus the entire narrative on immigration is a bad faith approach to the crisis. Immigration is a complicated layer on top of an already desperate situation, one that we have very few answers to currently, and on the eve of another Trump term, maybe even less so in the coming years. The reporting organizations, by the way, are called COCs, or Continuums of Care. Now, these are organizations that coordinate local, state, and federal solutions to manage services from food and shelter to navigating health systems and veterans care. And once a year, they come together to conduct this point-in-time count of unhoused individuals and families. Qualitatively, COCs have gotten much better over the years in aggregating these figures. We've also expanded the number of shelter beds available in the nation. And these are important nuances because remember that there are still many more people who are living out of sight in tent cities and encampments, motels, or with family members that don't make the count. So the numbers naturally increase if we have more beds and people can find shelter in them. Then again, if they're at capacity and people are resorting to these other areas, we can never really know the extent of the problem. But the bottom line is that the information is a guide. It's also a year old and incomplete, but it's what we got. Now, in terms of solutions, many of the organizations have adopted a particular philosophy known as housing first, which we'll get into extensively in a bit, because it's really at the core of this issue. And to bring us into that discussion, let's hear again from TYT.
I think the failure of the housing first policy is that it pursues a one size fits all approach to this issue. And this isn't a simple issue. This is actually a much more complex issue. We do need to build more housing. There's no question about that. But there are people who are struggling on the streets with severe addiction or severe mental health issues. So if you are someone who has a severe mental health condition, right? Let's say paranoid schizophrenia or something like that, you haven't been getting the medical care you need. Just taking you and putting you in a apartment unit is not going to solve the problem.
Now, to me, this is the worst part of their reporting because it's where they focus the discussion for the balance of the segment. Now, look, no one should be expected to be an expert in all things. I mean, it's one of the reasons I really took my time getting this piece out, right? And this is where it gets dicey, when you combine reporting and commentary in the new media landscape. The blurred lines between reporting and punditry, something that we all struggle to balance, makes it hard for viewers to build news literacy. And in this case, it's only by reading the entire report, sourcing organizations and thought leaders who work in this field, and examining independent analyses that one can build a comprehensive understanding of an issue. So if housing is a core non-negotiable, we need to be bulletproof. In this instance, it's actually pretty easy, which makes this reporting almost unforgivable in my estimation. Now, this is how easy this is. It's called housing first, not housing only, housing first. The housing first model, which prioritizes providing permanent housing to people experiencing homelessness before addressing other issues like unemployment or substance abuse, has shown remarkable success wherever it's been properly implemented. Studies consistently show that when people are housed first, they're able to better address the challenges in their lives, from mental health issues to substance disorders to unemployment. HUD's own research confirms this. According to their analysis, nearly everyone who enters the programs remains housed. The approach is not only more effective than traditional models, but also more cost-effective. Providing stable housing often costs less than the combined expenses of emergency services, law enforcement, and healthcare associated with chronic homelessness. Yet despite this evidence, Housing First faces relentless opposition from conservative think tanks and politicians who seem more interested in defending ideology than solving problems. The Cato Institute, for instance, has attempted to discredit Housing First by cherry-picking data and misrepresenting outcomes. Their criticism often focuses on California's implementation of Housing First principles, conveniently ignoring successful implementations elsewhere. And the fact that California's housing crisis is primarily driven by a severe housing shortage and skyrocketing costs rather than any particular intervention strategy. This ideological opposition to Housing First reveals a deeper truth about America's homelessness crisis. It persists not because we don't know how to solve it, but because powerful interests benefit from maintaining the status quo. Housing First was pioneered by Dr. Sam Simbaris in New York City in 1992 through his organization Pathways to Housing. The approach emerged as a direct response to the traditional treatment first models that required people experiencing homelessness to meet various prerequisites such as sobriety or employment before receiving housing assistance.
Programs require the person to be clean and sober, participate in treatment, and to somehow get ready for housing or demonstrate that they can keep it together so that they can give them housing. People have to earn it. Housing First doesn't have those requirements because we have found that people who are on the street and have these challenges can't earn it, no matter how hard they try, or don't see treatment as their priority. They see survival or housing as their priority.
The Housing First model is built on several fundamental principles: immediate access to housing without preconditions, consumer choice and self-determination, recovery orientation, individualized and person-driven supports, social and community integration. When Pathways to Housing launched their pioneering program in New York City, the initial implementation proved so successful that it quickly caught the attention of other organizations and cities across the country. And early research studies validated what practitioners were seeing on the ground, that this radical approach to ending homelessness was working. The model gained significant momentum in the new millennium. In 2000, the National Alliance to End Homelessness made a landmark decision to endorse Housing First, marking a crucial shift in how the nation's leading advocacy organization approached homelessness. This endorsement was followed by the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness beginning to actively promote the model. During this period, several major cities launched their own Housing First initiatives, each adapting the core principles to their local context while maintaining fidelity to the original model. The 2010s marked Housing First's transition from an innovative approach to federal policy. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, elevated Housing First to a central role in its strategic plan to end homelessness. The Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, followed suit, incorporating Housing First principles into its programs serving homeless veterans. Perhaps most significantly, the model became the standard practice across many continuums of care programs, fundamentally changing how communities approach homelessness. That's what drives me nuts about the lazy reporting on this issue. The headlines we choose to promote rip through the echo chamber like a bad game of telephone. That's how we wind up with this being a one-and-done story that barely made it to national media. And when it did, whether on cable news, major publications, or even TYT, the story reads, "Homelessness is up and immigration is one of the primary drivers. Looks like Housing First isn't working." Allowing these narratives to persist means that we'll have difficulty building momentum for important evidence-based solutions like Housing First. I mean, the data is astounding. Looking first at housing stability, 85 to 90% of participants remain housed after their first year in the program. Even more impressive, long-term studies show that 75 to 80% maintain housing after 5 years. These numbers stand in stark contrast to traditional treatment-first approaches, which typically see retention rates of only 30 to 40%. The financial impact of Housing First is just as striking. A 2021 study in Denver found that the Housing First participants generated 40% lower public costs compared to those in traditional programs. In LA County, in 2019, an analysis revealed the average savings of $20,000 per person annually. These findings echo earlier research from New York City, which documented net savings of $10,000 per year per person. These cost savings stem from reduced use of emergency services, lower incarceration rates, and decreased need for crisis intervention. The health impacts of Housing First extend far beyond cost savings. Communities implementing the model have seen emergency room visits drop by an average of 40%. Participants show marked improvements in mental health stability and demonstrate better management of chronic health conditions. Perhaps most importantly, they show increased engagement with primary care, shifting from crisis-driven to preventive health care. Now, during their segment, TYT casually notes that veteran homelessness actually decreased for the first time, which should be celebrated. But they didn't go one step further to point out that the VA adopted Housing First as its model. It's like, come on. And as always, it's important to break out of our ethnocentric bubble. International evidence further validates the model's effectiveness. In Finland, the National Housing First program has achieved incredible results, reducing long-term homelessness by 35% while generating cost savings of 15,000 euros per person annually. And after 7 years of the model, Finland boasts an 80% housing retention rate. Similarly, Austria and the Netherlands maintain extensive social housing systems that prevent homelessness before it occurs. These countries typically spend a higher percentage of their GDP on housing assistance and maintain larger social housing stocks than the United States. The result? Lower rates of homelessness and greater housing stability for vulnerable populations. It works here, it works there, it works everywhere, because it works. Conservative narratives about homelessness often focus on individual choices and personal responsibility, pointing to mental illness and substance use as primary causes. And while these factors can certainly contribute to housing instability, this framework fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between housing insecurity and personal challenges. The reality is that housing instability often precedes and exacerbates mental health and substance use issues rather than the other way around. Living on the streets is traumatic, and trauma can lead to or worsen mental health problems and substance abuse. Moreover, treating these issues effectively becomes nearly impossible without stable housing. Try maintaining a medication schedule or attending regular therapy sessions while living in a tent or searching daily for a place to sleep. The true drivers of America's homelessness crisis are structural. First off, there's a severe shortage of affordable housing, especially in major urban areas where jobs and opportunities are concentrated. Moreover, in recent decades, stagnant wages have combined with rising housing costs. We also have inadequate social safety nets. The U.S. provides far less housing assistance and other social support compared to peer nations, leaving many vulnerable people without a backup plan when a crisis strikes. Then there's the financialization of housing. The increasing treatment of housing as an investment vehicle rather than a basic need has led to policies that prioritize property values over housing accessibility. This is true for venture capital firms to individuals buying up rental properties for income on platforms like Vrbo and Airbnb. As usual, these are features of capitalism that turn into societal features when proper protections are removed. We have to make a choice. Either be a capitalist society in the way that Adam Smith envisioned it, which is closer to the modern version of social democracy, or lean into democratic socialism where issues like healthcare, housing, and labor are guaranteed and protected rights. That's why this has to be a non-negotiable. We have to get our side of the narrative down. The left can't get this part wrong because there are too many storms gathering right now that have the potential to turn this existing crisis into an all-out catastrophe. Population displacement due to climate change, something that's happening right now. What about the tens of thousands of homes and shelters that are being obliterated right now in Los Angeles? That's an example of this. That is real time, and it's in this country. An aging population living on fixed incomes that cannot sustain current housing and rental prices. Potential mass job losses due to AI job displacement. And an administration that will undoubtedly contribute even further to widening inequality and a loss of core services and safety net programs. So before we talk about holistic solutions from government investment into public affordable housing, universal housing vouchers, decriminalizing homelessness, reforming zoning laws, strengthening rent control, and wraparound support services to protect the most vulnerable, we have to agree on certain fundamentals like housing first and make universal shelter a non-negotiable rallying point. Here endeth the lesson.